What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. You know, one of the YouTubers out there who inspired me to become a YouTuber myself was a guy named Hutch. Sean0728, I think is his channel. You guys should go check him out because he's actually pretty awesome. It'd be awesome if you did. And he plays Call of Duty, but he kind of inspired me to become a YouTuber myself. So it'd be cool if you guys check that out. But anyway, we are covering JLA Earth 2, not to be confused with the New 52 Earth 2 story, which is also really good, and we'll start that when the Justice League movie comes out. Fun fact, normally Sundays are our Green Lantern days, but we'd be kind of foolhardy not to cover Justice League stuff with the Justice League movie coming out, so we're kind of postponing Brightest Day and then jumping back into it once we're done with our Green Lantern stuff. But JLA Earth 2 is a really cool story, but here's what I want you guys to do. I want you guys to imagine that DC is not publishing anything right now. I want you guys to wind your minds back to the year 2000. So there's no New 52, there's no DC Rebirth, none of that stuff. At the time this story is written, in the year 2000, DC exists in two forms. There's pre-crisis DC and post-crisis DC. Now, pre-crisis DC introduced a lot of different concepts, different universes, things like that. The one we're going to be talking about in this video is Earth 3, home of a group called the Crime Syndicate of America. Now, the way this story picks up is it initially just basically sees the arrival of what looks like Lex Luthor, but it's not actually Lex Luthor that we're familiar with, which is to say the evil guy who is the arch nemesis of Superman. Instead, this is just a Lex Luthor from a different dimension. This picks up with just the superheroes of the DC universe being superheroes, but their arrival, or I guess really their action, kind of coincides with the arrival of a plane that basically just appears out of thin air, more or less. The problem is that once they get on board the plane, once they try to get everybody back down to safety as they normally do, they end up finding out everybody on board is dead. And as they go through and they look at the flight recorder, they end up finding out that Lex Luthor is in some form or fashion tied into it. And that's when we start finding out the basis behind the nature of this version of Lex Luthor. The coolest thing about this is that Lex basically takes off, he goes to his main base, back to LexCorp, and he's doing all kinds of generous things that we normally never see, giving people pay raises, not being jerks to people. It's really interesting to see like how he functions in this capacity because he's a genuinely good guy. But because of the fact that Lex Luthor has historically been a villain of Superman, even if he is doing charitable things, the belief of Superman, of Martian Manhunter, of Wonder Woman, of Kyle Rayner the Green Lantern is that there's some kind of an ulterior motive. And that's when he basically says, I'm not the Lex Luthor that you know, I am a person named Alexander Luthor. And that's the difference here. Now, this brings into the equation the whole idea of what this place is and how it functions and exactly how it works. Now, we jump back to this other version of Earth. And again, we'll make sense of all this stuff. I'm not going to leave you guys in the dark and we're not going to be ambiguous this whole video, but we jump back to this alternate version of Earth and we end up having a version of Superman with a U on his chest. This is Ultraman. Kind of weird to see this where he's basically just dumping fake money to everybody, and where they believe it's true, they're kind of relishing in this idea of free cash. But when they start to figure out that it's false and one of them badmouths Ultraman uses his heat vision to incinerate this guy. And that's the importance of this, is because this gives us this dark version of Superman. Now, in the pre-crisis DC, which basically DC between when it first popped up in 1938, more or less, running up till 1985, in 1960, the Justice League was by and large the most popular team they'd ever put together. Now, the Justice League was not the first time that a team composed of superheroes had ever banded together and then fought against bad guys. For DC itself, its most popular superhero team before the Justice League was the Justice Society of America. And the JSA was basically a team composed of superheroes who were struggling more or less to sell their own comics, as well as those who were definitely selling their own comics. You saw things like Hawkman, and you saw like the Flash Jay Garrick, and so on and so forth. But it was a team of superheroes that came together to fight crime. In 1960, because of the fact that DC had experienced this sort of second renaissance of comic book interest, because of the fact that science fiction comics were so popular, superheroes were fading, and so DC blended superheroes and science fiction together in the form of the origin story of Barry Allen the Flash. Because of the fact that this whole idea was so wildly popular, in 1960, under, I think, Julius Schwartz, and I believe they were created by Otto Bender, the Justice League was created. Now, the idea was that the Justice League had Batman and Superman in the title, but it was funny because DC realized and they knew that Batman and Superman were the 1-2 punch. They were the two most popular characters they were publishing at the time. And much like the original JSA, the Justice League was designed to boost the profile of characters who were not Batman or Superman. And it worked. I mean, it was hugely popular when it came out. It was insane. It was a license to print money. It was crazy how popular it was. It really was up until like Marvel came along. And then it raised the profiles of both companies even higher because now fans had competition. So it was cool. But the whole idea was that in 1964, because because of the fact that the Justice League was so popular, DC sat down and asked the question. They said, well, what if the Justice League was evil? And that's where the Crime Syndicate came into play. The Crime Syndicate comes from a place called Earth 3, but that's where Alexander Luthor comes from, because on Earth 3, the way it was in the pre-crisis continuity, it was basically the opposite. Lex Luthor was a good guy, the superheroes were bad guys. The problem was that when Crisis on Infinite Earths happened in 1985, DC had to find a way to basically bring these concepts back without using the multiverse, because the multiverse didn't exist. Between 1985 and 2006 with Infinite Crisis, you just had one universe. And so DC had to say, okay, we have these characters that originated from the multiverse before Crisis on Infinite Earths, but like, how do we explain their origins now? And so the cool thing about this is that this sees the return of the Crime Syndicate for the first time following the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And so what Alexander Luthor basically says is that while this is a singular universe that exists here, he comes from a place called the Antimatter Universe. Now, in truth, this is just Grant Morrison being Grant Morrison. And what I mean by that is after Crisis on Infinite Earths, Grant Morrison came on board, and he'd been writing before that, but he came on board as a guy who did like a lot of huge things. After Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC got rid of the Justice League in their traditional form. Instead, we got Justice League International. And that ran, for a while under like Keith Giffen and JMD Mateus. They eventually left. The title didn't perform as well as it did under their writing and artistry. And so as a result, DC brought the JLA back in 1998, and Grant Morrison was the one who wrote it. And fans loved it. That's where you get stories like Tower of Babel. Morrison was basically given a license to just kind of do whatever he wanted to. This alongside stories like DC 1 Million, All-Star Superman. This was really just one of these things where he could just kind of do whatever he wanted to do. But the whole idea here is him basically saying, well, the Antimatter Universe exists out there somewhere. It's just this universe where it's antimatter, and that's just kind of it. Now, one of the things that throws people off is the nature of the story's titling and some of the things that Alexander Luthor says. Alexander Luthor refers to the Earth of the superheroes, the Superman, Batman, the good guys we're reading about right now. He refers to them as Earth 2. That is not meant to be taken in a literal sense. It's not meant to say that DC is referring to this as Earth 2. It's how Alexander Luthor views it. But him showing up with this fantastic tale of, we have basically versions of you on my Earth, but they have different names like Owlman and Power Ring and Superwoman, and they're basically evil and they conquered my world. Nobody really believes it right off the bat. Batman, above all others, is just like, this is utter nonsense. Like, it's it's funny to see how Batman responds because it's typical Batman. But also keep in mind here that one of the aspects of Superman, whether it's a failing, whether it's what makes him a great superhero, is his willingness to give people the benefit of the doubt. And his argument is, well, at the very least, let's just hear him out. Let's put it to a vote and let's go to his reality and see whether or not that's the case. And so what they end up agreeing on is that a bulk of the Justice League will go to this Antimatter Universe where the Crime Syndicate is, but Aquaman and Martian Manhunter are going to stay behind. One of the first people we're introduced to is Owlman, and it's actually a really cool concept. So Owlman, as he was reintroduced here, and again, we're ignoring all the New 52 stuff, Owlman, as he was introduced here, is basically Thomas Wayne Jr. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that in this Crime Syndicate world, things unfolded in radically different ways. In the main DC universe, Thomas and Martha Wayne were killed in a mugging gone wrong by a guy named Joe Chill. Bruce Wayne was just stuck without any parents, he swore revenge, and eventually became Batman. In the Crime Syndicate landscape, it's not that way. Instead, Jim Gordon, who's normally the police commissioner, became a crime boss. And when he did, he ordered the death of Martha Wayne. Thomas Wayne basically became the new police commissioner. And the son, who would normally be Bruce Wayne, is Thomas Wayne Jr. And Thomas Wayne Jr. went on to become Owlman. The other half of this is that we also pick up with Superwoman. And it's kind of crazy because Superwoman and Owlman are basically having an affair. I mean, that's kind of the way things go with them. But Superwoman is essentially Wonder Woman, except things changed up a little bit. So unlike Wonder Woman, who basically went on a mission of sorts to explore outside Themyscira, Superwoman just left. She adopted the identity of Lois Lane. She's married to Ultraman, but she's cheating on him with Owlman. So their question is, what in the world is going on when it comes to, the whole idea of where Alexander Luthor went, and should we even be worried about it? Because with Alexander Luthor being like the lone good guy, he's constantly trying to defeat them. But there's also a couple other characters that were introduced here named Power Ring and Johnny Quick. Now again, because of the fact that this is a reboot of sorts, or a reimagining of the original Crime Syndicate, some liberties are taken here with Grant Morrison Morrison. For example, the original Johnny Quick, we basically know nothing about him when he first showed up. All we knew is that he has a helmet that gives him super speed. In this story, it's not the same way. It's essentially a concoction of sorts. It's a chemical that he takes that maintains his super speed. Power Ring is basically a guy who's got the Ring of Volthoom. Now, this will be the one instance in this story where we reference modern day events in DC Comics. Volthoom is a weird concept. So there were basically two versions of Volthoom for years and years and years and years. You had Volthoom, who was inside Power Ring's ring. Then you had Volthoom in DC Comics, who was the first Lantern. And DC never bridged the gap between the two. At least they didn't for quite some time. What ended up happening is when DC Rebirth kicked off, writer Sam Humphries came along and bridged the gap. What he basically said is that in some far-off universe somewhere, Volthoom's world was essentially coming to an end. And so in an attempt to find people that could basically save his Earth, he and his mother created the Travel Lantern, which allows him to jump from one universe to the next. Somewhere along the line, he ended up on the home universe of the Crime Syndicate of America. And what ended up happening is that some monk out there somewhere had basically taken a fraction of Volthoom's soul and confined it inside of a lantern so that that power could be used. But the whole idea is that the character or the concept of Volthoom inside the ring that's used by Power Ring is a fraction of the soul of Volthoom, the first Lantern. So that was something that didn't come along until really like this year. But at the time this story was written, with regards to the original Power Ring character, Volthoom is just some presence inside of his ring. And ultimately he became a member of the Crime Syndicate. That's really it. That's really all there is to it. Something else that I want to point out here is that when it comes to the character of Johnny Quick, his injection of the substance that allows him to run at super speed, it's very much drawn to the idea of a drug addiction. And that's why it's such a significant thing, because when Grant Morrison writes stories, he writes them in a way that makes them tangible, that makes them almost relatable, but there are dark aspects about it. And that's really kind of how this is thrown in there. Ultimately, when the Justice League shows up in the Crime Syndicate universe, the first question is, okay, what's this world like? And as they go through, all they see are people who are just living without any real measure of hope in a world that is, for the most part, just inherently violent. Now, of course, it's also Batman traveling directly to the office of Thomas Wayne. And what we end up finding out is that where Thomas Wayne is the police commissioner, because of the fact that everything on this world is basically evil, that almost all the cops are extremely corrupt, except for like 30 of them who are loyal to Thomas Wayne, and that's about it. But that's like his inner circle. Batman showing up in the office of Thomas Wayne and essentially saying, I'm here to help, is kind of a crazy scenario, because this story fed directly and really influenced the events of like DC Rebirth and The Button when Batman met his father in the New 52 continuity for the first time. So that's one of the cool things. That's why I say Grant Morrison's stories are really, in a lot of ways, the basis for other stories that come along. Now, of course, what he says is the Crime Syndicate's regime is over. In 48 hours, everything's going to be done. And that's because Alexander Luthor calculated that out. And his mind, all they need is a 48-hour window. In 48 hours, given the speed and the strength and all the abilities of the members of the Justice League, they can basically hold the Crime Syndicate prisoner, and they can in turn fix the world. One of the first acts that they make is to basically have Kyle Rayner essentially use his Green Lantern ring to subdue the Crime Syndicate by blocking them off, creating a massive portal or a massive force field of sorts around the moon, and then they can't get away. And that's really about it. This basically allows the Justice League to come along and say, we're going to make your world a better place. And they do this by basically going to the president and saying, look, the Crime Syndicate's going to be out of the picture now. You will be able to essentially run your country the way a government should. We end up finding out that when the United States and Britain went to war during the Revolutionary War, that where Benedict Arnold actually declared war on Britain, that ultimately Britain was just kind of devastated by the United States. Now, again, this is another instance of the differences between the Crime Syndicate world and the main DC universe. But notice this, and that's the irony of all this, is that Superman kind of makes this objection where he says, I mean, are we really doing the right thing here? Because what we're doing is we're showing up on an alternate Earth and we're saying, you guys need freedom. And what happens if people say, well, no, we don't want freedom? Oh, the superhero is going to say, yeah, but like you need it though. We know what's good for you, even if you don't. It's an extreme act of arrogance. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's the nature of it. That's kind of the message that Grant Morrison is sending. But we begin to find out there is a darker side when it comes to this Crime Syndicate world. Everything on this world is the opposite of the main DC universe. In the main DC universe, good is the way to go. In the Crime Syndicate world, evil is the way to go. And that's the lesson the superheroes begin to learn. Where Boss Gordon, Jim Gordon is basically arrested by Thomas Wayne Sr. and he's essentially just kind of sent off to jail. When it's all said and done and Batman says, now you have the ability to make the world a better place, Thomas Wayne's response is, yes, I'm going to do that. And anybody who disagrees with me is going to die. And so that's when Batman begins to realize this world can't be fixed. It's the natural order of the world that evil will always prevail. That's what Owlman figures out. While the crime syndicate's being held captive by the Justice League, that it's the natural order of the world, that evil always comes out on top. That even if you show up and you do something good, people's response to that will be an evil act. They will basically say, okay, cool. Instead of saying, man, you liberated us and you saved us from these evil people, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make the world a better place. Instead, their response is, awesome, you got rid of those power-hungry people, now we can replace them. And so because of that, Owlman also comes to the conclusion that essentially it's inevitable they're going to swap places. Where the jet that was used that showed up in the main DC universe with everybody on board who was dead, because that was something that took 24 hours to complete, the whole idea of Owlman is they're inevitably going to switch places. All they have to do is jump back. And that's what ends up happening. The crime syndicate just vanishes from their captivity on the moon. And then when the question's asked, where did they go? Lex Luthor and everybody else begins to realize they went back to the main DC universe. And so they effectively invade the main DC universe itself. Now, their attack and their attempt to subdue it is pretty short-lived. You have Aquaman, you have like Martian Manhunter who respawn. It's one of these cool scenarios because Martian Manhunter ends up subduing Ultraman. But what we end up learning is that Ultraman is basically powered by anti-kryptonite. And what had essentially happened is that this version was essentially a guy named Clark Kent who was a pilot. And he kind of went on a mission in space. He was taken by aliens. He was basically reconstituted. They enhanced him, but it drove him insane. He arrived back on Earth calling himself Ultraman, essentially with Superman's powers. The problem with this is that instead of being like Superman where he draws his power from solar radiation from a yellow sun, Ultraman draws his power from anti-kryptonite. The issue is that much like Superman and a yellow sun, the further away Ultraman is from anti-kryptonite, the weaker he gets. And so as a result, his anti-kryptonite is in a different universe. And so all he has left is whatever power is inside of his body. And the more power he uses, the more power he loses. And so with that in mind, while he does seem like he could successfully face off against Martian Manhunter, he ends up losing just because of the fact that he's just draining his own power. He's draining his own energy. And so what we end up finding out here is that where the Flash is basically just kind of powering this cyclotron more or less, that's going to be the means by which the Justice League can jump back to their reality. We also end up finding out that there was somebody else who was working behind the scenes. Alexander Luthor begins asking the question, why did those jets end up in those realities in the first place? Why did a jet from the positive, from the main DC universe end up in the Crime Syndicate universe? And why did a jet from the Crime Syndicate universe end up in the DC universe? Did somebody send them there? And that's the conclusion that he runs to, that somebody was testing out whether or not this interdimensional portal device would work. And the person who was testing it was Brainiac. And so that's why this is cool, is because what we end up finding out here is that Brainiac, as he exists on the Crime Syndicate world, is essentially a servant of Ultraman, but that Brainiac was captured by Ultraman when he was just kind of bruising the universe, the Antimatter Universe, and then was ultimately used as kind of like this source of knowledge and information and so on and so forth to make the best possible decisions in terms of logic and reason and so on. But while Brainiac was serving as this sort of errand boy to Ultraman, his intelligence was constantly evolving until he basically saw it as the best opportunity to leave. And much like Skynet going live in the Terminator universe, Brainiac just starts spreading throughout essentially the digital sphere itself. And so what he starts doing is merging the Earth 3 universe and the main DC universe into one, trying to converge them into a singular universe to do whatever it is that he wants to do, trying to merge the Earths together. And so of course, the Justice League comes to realize that because of the fact that this Crime Syndicate world cannot be saved, they do the only thing they can do, which is in order to defeat Brainiac, to walk away, to basically just say, we're going to leave this Earth to its fate. There's nothing we can do. At the same time, we end up having this moment where the Justice League sent back to their own universe, the Crime Syndicate is yanked back to their Earth, that Ultraman was also told by Owlman, that's what's going on here. Brainiac is the one that tricked us into this. And so with Ultraman arriving on the scene, what he ends up doing is basically zapping and more or less lobotomizing Brainiac. But that's the nature of this story. The whole idea of JLA Earth 2 was not to just tell a story where it's the Crime Syndicate versus the Justice League and who's gonna win. It was basically designed to say that there is such a thing as hopelessness, that there is such a thing as a world out there where the day cannot be saved. Not because they face insurmountable odds in terms of some enemy who's super strong or super fast or something like that, but because the Earth itself doesn't want to be fixed. It is a social critique on society. It's Grant Morrison sitting down and saying, there's a difference between people who say they want things to change and people who believe they want things to change. That doing things changes things. Doing nothing keeps things exactly as they are. And that's the point that he makes, that there are people out there who just don't want things to change, that for whatever reason, they just want to live in, anger and sadness and squalor and, just be miserable. And with those folks, they can't be changed. No matter what you do, they will not leave that mindset. They will stay in that mindset forever. There is no saving them. They're beyond redemption. Whereas in the main DC universe, people do want a better tomorrow. People do want to look to the future. They look to the horizon and want to believe that things can be better than they are. And that's the inherent difference. Sometimes the Justice League just can't win. Sometimes the enemy they face is not an opponent, it's an ideology, and you cannot defeat an ideology so long as people genuinely want to believe it. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, definitely one of my favorite Justice League stories out there. I think it's beautifully done. It's super cool. It's really, really interesting. And yeah, we're gonna bring this video to an end, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.